The winter of 1941 was unforgiving. The streets of Moscow were buried under snow, and the German Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, found itself strangled by the Russian winter and relentless Soviet resistance. Hitler's ambition to crush the Soviet Union and claim Lebensraum was turning into a nightmare. Soldiers froze, machines broke down, and morale crumbled. Yet, in Berlin, the Führer's confidence remained, unwavering, his hubris blinding him to the reality on the Eastern Front. Stalin, in contrast, appeared unshakable. Despite the massive losses during Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet leader rallied his nation. Propaganda posters screamed resilience, factories churned out tanks and rifles, and every citizen was a soldier in spirit. The German advance slowed, halted, and eventually, the Red Army began to push back. Hitler's strategic miscalculations, combined with an underestimation of Soviet determination, sowed the seeds of his eventual defeat. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was observing the unfolding catastrophe. FDR understood the stakes. If Hitler succeeded in the East, Europe would fall entirely under Nazi domination. The Lend-Lease Act ensured vital supplies reached Britain and the Soviet Union, fueling their resistance. Across battlefields in North Africa and the Mediterranean, the Axis powers struggled against allied forces, stretching their resources thin. Hitler's hatred, especially towards Jews, Slavs, and communists, had clouded his strategic judgment, replacing calculated military strategy with ideological obsession. In the streets of Berlin, whispers of defeat began circulating. High-ranking generals questioned the Führer's orders, yet fear kept them silent. The Gestapo ensured obedience, but it could not mask the growing cracks in Hitler's war machine. Soldiers, once proud, now marched with uncertainty. Morale was failing, not only at the front lines, but within the heart of the Third Reich itself. The war was no longer a series of quick victories. It had become a war of attrition, survival, of endurance against an enemy determined to fight to the last man. Hitler's decisions, driven by fear of betrayal and obsession with hatred, alienated even his most loyal commanders. While his speeches spoke of victory, reality whispered defeat. This was the beginning of the unraveling a chapter where ideology would clash disastrously with reality, and the world would witness the consequences of unbridled hatred on a global scale. June 22, 1941, the world held its breath. At dawn, without a formal declaration of war, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the largest invasion in human history. Hitler believed this campaign would last only a few months. His generals promised a swift victory. The Wehrmacht stormed forward like lightning, crushing Soviet defenses in the opening weeks. Entire divisions vanished under German firepower. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell one after another. To the outside world, it looked as though Hitler was unstoppable once again. Nazi propaganda glorified the advance as a heroic crusade against Bolshevism. But beneath the victories, fatal cracks were forming. The German supply line stretched hundreds of miles long. Ammunition, fuel, and food failed to keep pace with the fast-moving troops. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, refused to surrender. Instead, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy. Every field burned, every bridge destroyed, every village evacuated. If the Germans wanted land, they would inherit only ashes. The brutality of the Eastern Front shocked even seasoned soldiers. Villages burned to the ground, and millions of civilians were caught between two merciless regimes. Hitler's racial hatred poisoned his own war effort. Instead of winning hearts and minds in occupied territories, the Nazis brought terror, executions, starvation, and enslavement. Resistance movements began to rise, fueled by vengeance and desperation. Every bullet fired in hatred only strengthened the resolve of the people. As summer turned to autumn, the German advance slowed. The Soviet resistance grew fiercer. Reinforcements from Siberia, trained to fight in the harshest conditions, began arriving near Moscow. The Red Army, once in disarray, was reorganized, disciplined, and determined. Hitler, blinded by arrogance, ignored his general's warnings and pushed forward toward Moscow. He believed one more push would end the war in the east, but as the first snowflakes fell, the truth became undeniable. Germany was unprepared for the Russian winter. Trucks froze solid, rifles jammed, and frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. The Blitzkrieg had met its match not in armies or weapons, but in ice, distance, and Soviet resilience. Hitler refused to retreat, demanding his men hold their positions at all costs. Those who disobeyed were executed. The once victorious Wehrmacht now faced starvation, exhaustion, and death in a land that swallowed empires whole. Operation Barbarossa, intended as the path to glory, had become the road to ruin. December 1941, the snow over Russia was deep and merciless. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. The German army, once lightning fast and confident, now found itself trapped in a frozen hell. Engines refused to start, rifles jammed, and men froze to death in their sleep. The Wehrmacht had been promised a quick victory, but instead, they faced nature's wrath and the iron will of the Soviet people. In Moscow, Stalin refused to abandon the capital. He delivered a fiery speech, not one step back. His words echoed through the streets and factories. Civilians dug trenches, women sewed uniforms, and soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to die for their homeland. As German forces approached the outskirts of Moscow, the Soviet counterattack began. The Red Army unleashed newly arrived Siberian divisions, hardened warriors accustomed to the cold. For the first time, the Nazi war machine was forced to retreat. The myth of Hitler's invincibility began to crumble. German morale shattered as entire divisions were decimated by frostbite, hunger, and Soviet firepower. Soldiers huddled in snow-filled foxholes, haunted by the endless blizzards and the ghosts of fallen comrades. Hitler, furious and paranoid, blamed his generals for failure, but refused to withdraw. His obsession turned deadly, not just for his enemies, but for his own men. Behind enemy lines, Soviet partisans sabotaged rail lines and ambushed supply convoys. Every bridge destroyed, every communication line cut, further strangled the German advance. The once unstoppable Blitzkrieg had been buried under the snow. For every German soldier who marched east, 10 froze or starved before seeing another sunrise. And yet, the suffering was not one-sided. Soviet civilians endured unimaginable horror. Entire villages vanished under bombardment, families starved, cities burned, and millions were displaced. But the people refused to surrender. Their pain transformed into defiance, a fire that burned even in the coldest winter. By the end of 1941, the world had changed. Germany's dream of conquering the Soviet Union had been shattered by frost, fire, and the human spirit. What was meant to be Hitler's greatest triumph had become his greatest disaster. The road to Moscow had turned into a graveyard, not just of soldiers, but of the Nazi illusion of invincibility. The frozen fields of Russia whispered one truth into the icy wind. The Third Reich was not unstoppable. It could bleed, it could break, and it would fall. The summer of 1942 brought renewed German fury. Hitler, enraged by failure in Moscow, turned his eyes south to the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Capturing it would be both a strategic victory and a symbolic humiliation for the Soviet leader. For Hitler, Stalingrad wasn't just a city, it was an obsession. The Luftwaffe began its assault with devastating air raids. Within days, Stalingrad was reduced to rubble and ashes. But from those ruins, a new kind of warfare was born, street by street, house by house, room by room. The Soviet defenders turned every shattered building into a fortress. Snipers lurked in shadows. Grenades replaced artillery. The Volga River, once peaceful, now carried the blood of thousands. For months, the battle raged without mercy. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because fighting took place in basements, tunnels, and the ruins of factories. Soldiers fought over staircases, floors, even single rooms. Victory or death was the only choice. General Vasily Chukov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, vowed that Stalingrad would not fall. His orders were simple: Hold this city or die in it. Hitler demanded total victory. He poured men and resources into the cauldron, ignoring the cries of his generals. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, pushed deeper into the city, believing victory was within reach. But behind the smoke and fire, Stalin was preparing his counterattack Operation Uranus. Soviet forces secretly encircled the Germans, trapping over 300,000 Axis troops in a deadly pocket. Winter came again. Supplies ran out. The mighty German army, once conqueror of Europe, was now starving, freezing, and surrounded. Paulus pleaded for permission to retreat, but Hitler's response was absolute. Not one step back. The Sixth Army would stand to the last man. And so they did, until hunger, disease, and despair broke their will. On February 2, 1943, General Paulus surrendered. Out of 300,000 German soldiers, barely 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner, and only a fraction ever returned home. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. It marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. From that frozen city on the Volga, the tide of war began to turn. The hunters had become the hunted, while the snows of Stalingrad buried the German dream in the east. Another war raged under the blazing sun of North Africa. The vast deserts stretched endlessly, golden by day, frozen by night, a battlefield unlike any other. Here, the legendary Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, led the Afrika Korps with unmatched brilliance. His tactics were swift, daring, and unpredictable. The British called him a ghost, striking fast and vanishing into the sands. For a time, it seemed Rommel might succeed where others had failed. But by late 1942, the tide was shifting. The Allies, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, launched Operation Lightfoot at the Battle of El Alamein. The night sky erupted in thunder as thousands of artillery guns roared in unison. The desert trembled. Rommel's forces, already short on supplies and fuel, faced a storm they could not withstand. Montgomery's strategy was precise: grind the enemy down, inch by inch, until they could no longer stand. Winston Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Those words captured the moment the world began to believe again. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American troops landed in North Africa under Operation Torch. British and American forces linked up, squeezing the Axis from both sides. The dream of a German empire stretching through Africa and the Middle East crumbled under the weight of Allied tanks and superior logistics. For the first time, Hitler's armies were retreating not because of the weather, but because they were being outfought. Rommel fought bravely, but even the Desert Fox could not fight without supplies. Allied bombers cut off German convoys from Italy, and the Mediterranean became a graveyard of ships. By May 1943, the last Axis forces in Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 soldiers taken prisoner. The sands that had once glowed with the promise of conquest now buried the hopes of the Reich. From the ashes of defeat in Africa rose a new strength, the Allied unity that would soon storm the beaches of Europe. Britain, America, and the Free French found new confidence. The world had seen proof the Axis could be beaten. And for Hitler, the loss of North Africa was not just a military blow. It was the beginning of a series of humiliations that would lead his empire toward total collapse. The defeat in North Africa was a blow that echoed far beyond the desert sands. Adolf Hitler and his Axis partner, Benito Mussolini, watched their empires crumble as the Allies gained momentum. But Italy, the birthplace of fascism, was not yet finished with the war. In July 1943, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily, the first step in bringing Mussolini's fascist regime to its knees. Operation Husky began on the night of July 9, 1943, when thousands of British and American paratroopers landed behind enemy lines. While naval bombardments softened up coastal defenses, the beaches of Sicily became the stage for a brutal struggle. The Axis forces, caught off guard, fought back fiercely, but the Allies had the advantage of surprise and overwhelming air support. Within weeks, Sicily fell to the Allies. the site of Italian and German forces retreating across the island was the first sign that Mussolini's grip on power was slipping. For Mussolini, the loss of Sicily was a turning point. The Italian people had suffered through years of war, and their faith in the fascist regime was rapidly eroding. On July 25, 1943, after a vote by the Grand Council of Fascism, Mussolini was deposed by his own government and arrested. King Victor Emmanuel III, in a bold move, relieved Mussolini of his duties as prime minister and began negotiating with the Allies. The man who had once been called Il Duce, the supreme leader, now found himself imprisoned by the very nation he had led into war. But Mussolini's story was not over. As the Allies advanced through Italy, Hitler took action to save his ally. On September 12, 1943, a daring rescue mission led by German commandos freed Mussolini from his imprisonment. The Italian Social Republic, a puppet state set up by Hitler in northern Italy, was born. Mussolini, now a figurehead of a broken regime, attempted to rally Italians to the cause, but his authority had been shattered. His country was divided, and the resistance to fascism grew stronger by the day. Meanwhile, the Allied forces began their march up the Italian peninsula, facing fierce resistance from both German and Italian fascist troops. Monte Cassino, one of the most heavily fortified positions in Europe, stood in their path. It became a symbol of the brutality of the Italian campaign. The Allies struggled to break through, and thousands of lives were lost in the battle for every inch of ground. Yet the Italians were not the only ones who suffered. Civilians bore the brunt of the violence as cities were bombed and destroyed, leaving countless innocent people in ruins. But the war was turning. Mussolini's dream of a fascist Europe was rapidly fading, and his regime was crumbling. The surrender of Italy to the Allies on September 8, 1943, marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's fascist rule. Italy was now an occupied country, divided between German-controlled North and Allied-controlled South. June 6, 1944, the world held its breath as the greatest amphibious invasion in history unfolded. D-Day, Operation Overlord was the Allied plan to open a second front against Nazi Germany. After years of planning, deception, and preparation, the moment had arrived. At dawn, 156,000 Allied troops, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, stormed the beaches of Normandy. The sound of the sea was drowned out by the deafening roar of artillery. Landing crafts hit the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The soldiers aboard had known this would be the hardest fight of their lives, but they came anyway. They came because the fate of Europe and the world depended on them. The beaches were a nightmare. Machine gun fire tore into the first wave of soldiers as they hit the sand. Mines exploded, and the air was thick with smoke. On Omaha Beach, American forces faced the worst resistance. Thousands of men fell, but for every fallen soldier, more stepped forward. Courageous medics, engineers, and soldiers with rifles in hand pressed on, fighting their way inch by inch up the shore. But the Allies were prepared. Behind the beaches, the greatest concentration of airborne forces ever assembled in history had parachuted. In the night before, paratroopers from the US, Britain, and Canada landed in fields and forests to secure vital roadways and cut off German reinforcements. The skies were filled with transport planes, and at dawn, gliders silently landed behind enemy lines. For the Germans, it was chaos. Their defenses, once thought impregnable, began to crumble under the weight of the assault. Hitler had expected an invasion to come, but he never expected it to come here, at Normandy. His commanders had been deceived by a brilliant ruse known as Operation Fortitude, which led them to believe that the Allies would land in Pas-de-Calais, further north. The Germans were caught off guard, and confusion reigned. By the end of the day, despite the horrific casualties, the Allies had secured the beachheads. More than 10,000 men had died or been wounded, but the invasion had succeeded. The Nazi defenses had been breached, and Western Europe was now open to the liberating armies. For the first time in nearly 5 years, the Allies were on the march to Paris, and with every liberated town, with every victory, the people of France and Belgium erupted in joy. The horrors of Nazi occupation, the brutality of the Gestapo, the oppression, all were beginning to fade. The Allies were coming, and Europe had hope again. The battle for Normandy was far from over, but D-Day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It was the moment the Nazis feared most, the moment the Allies had returned to free Europe. As winter descended on Europe, the Allies stood on the doorstep of Nazi Germany. It was December 1944, and victory seemed within reach. But Adolf Hitler, determined to regain momentum, launched one final gamble. In the forests of the Ardennes, deep in Belgium, the last great German offensive of the war was about to unfold. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was audacious. He aimed to split the Allied forces in two, cutting off supply lines and forcing the Allies into a retreat. He would take Antwerp, the key port for Allied supplies, and then turn his sights on Paris. The German High Command believed that a breakthrough here, the cold, treacherous terrain of the Ardennes, might offer a glimmer of hope. But the Allies, battered from their earlier victories, were caught off guard. On December 16, 1944, the German Blitzkrieg tore through the thinly defended lines of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division. The Americans had expected a quiet winter. Instead, they were engulfed by the might of the Wehrmacht. The surprise attack caused confusion, and the Germans made significant gains. They created a bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. For several weeks, the Allies were forced to fight desperately for every inch of ground. The weather, as always, was brutal. Heavy snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and muddy roads turned the battlefield into a hell on earth. Soldiers froze in the trenches, and supplies were desperately low. Yet, despite the odds, the American forces, bolstered by fresh troops and supplies, began to regroup. The battle became a test of endurance, not just for the soldiers, but for the entire Allied war effort. On December 26, General Patton's Third Army launched a counter-offensive, pushing back the Germans and breaking through their lines. The German offensive stalled. The Allies, though battered, were not defeated. The final blow came when British and American forces linked up and encircled the remaining German troops in the Ardennes. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had ended in defeat for the Germans. They had failed to split the Allied lines. Instead, they had wasted their last reserves. The battle had cost both sides dearly, over 185,000 casualties in total. But for the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. Their forces were shattered, their reserves exhausted, and their morale broken. With the failure of the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies resumed their march toward Berlin. The Germans had no more offensive capacity left. The push to liberate Europe and destroy the Nazi regime once and for all was now unstoppable. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was on its last legs. The once mighty Nazi war machine had been shattered. Allied forces had breached the German border, and the Soviet Red Army, advancing from the east, was closing in on Berlin. The end was inevitable, but in the crumbling heart of the Reich, Adolf Hitler remained defiant, holed up in his Führerbunker, refusing to acknowledge reality. As Soviet forces reached the outer defenses of Berlin in April 1945, the German capital was already a city in ruins. The streets had been bombed into oblivion by relentless Allied airstrikes, leaving only skeletal buildings and charred rubble. Hitler's generals, now facing total collapse, begged him to surrender. But Hitler, consumed by paranoia and delusion, refused. The man who had once promised to conquer Europe now watched as his empire fell apart around him. Inside the Führerbunker, a grim atmosphere prevailed. The once grand leader of the Nazi regime was a broken figure, isolated from the world. His loyal followers, including Eva Braun, his companion for many years, remained at his side. But they, too, saw the end drawing near. Hitler's closest confidants, including Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring, still clung to a hope that some miracle would save them. But deep down, they knew the truth. As the Soviets launched their final assault on the city, German resistance crumbled. The Red Army, in a brutal push, advanced through the streets. Street by street, building by building. The fighting was fierce, and the Soviets were determined to capture Berlin, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, leading the Soviet forces, ordered no mercy for the enemy. Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi authority, and by April 30, 1945, the flag of the Soviet Union flew over it. It was then, on that fateful day, that Adolf Hitler took his own life. Overcome by defeat and despair, he ingested cyanide and shot himself. His body was later burned, as per his orders, to prevent it from being captured. Eva Braun, his longtime partner, also took her life by swallowing cyanide. They were both gone. The architects of the war that had cost millions their lives had now met their end. The fall of Berlin marked the official end of the Third Reich, but the true devastation would take years to heal. Europe lay in ruins. Tens of millions had died. The Holocaust had left scars too deep to fathom. And yet, the world would slowly rebuild, learning the hard lessons of tyranny, hate, and the cost of unchecked ambition. The victory came with the realization that the war had been more than a battle for power. It had been a struggle for humanity itself. The defeat of Nazi Germany meant that the world had, for the moment, rejected the darkness that had consumed it. But the shadows would linger in the memories, in the lessons, in the peace that followed.